Hello and welcome into the Cubs on Deck podcast. I am one of your hosts. My name is Greg Huss, and today I am joined by the other Greg for the first time in a hot minute. I'm joined by Greg Zumach. Dude, how we doing?
I'm doing great. We'll get to a little bit of this, but this is heavy draft time for me. So I am knee deep in the 2024 draft. I'm ankle deep in the 2025 draft. And then a smidge of 2026 out there.
Oh man, you are
And
a
trying to
nerd.
get boards and figure stuff out and make sure that I know which players are in which class. And the 6'8" righty who's a UCLA commit that I saw this weekend, and writing up notes and realizing, oh yeah, we've got a whole extra year on him. So just a lot of fun. Still going to cover some prospects, but yeah, we're knee deep in the draft time, and this is like my prime time this summer.
This is like as crazy of a prospect time as it gets during the year, I think. I mean, because right now we have the draft coming up in less than 2 weeks. The draft is
Yep.
on the first round is on
14th.
July 14th.
14th.
Yep.
Yep.
The first round is on July 14th, less than 2 weeks away. We got the first half of the minor league season just ended. Those playoff races just finished up. We're going to be dropping our prospect rankings over at Northside Bound in the meantime, not to throw more on your plate, Zumach, but we're going to be dropping our prospect rankings. And we do that strategically. So we're doing it before the draft so that we're not when the draft happens, we know kind of generally where guys could potentially rank without putting it into words, because that gets a little weird. So we want to update the rankings before the draft. We want to update the rankings before the trade deadline, and that's happening later this month. It is. And we're in the heat of actual games going on, right? In addition to all the other stuff, there's actual games happening. And so this is about as crazy as it gets. We're going to be, like you said, we're going to be talking a little bit about the draft at the tail end here, just because we won't chat with you before the draft actually happens. But we're going to spend a lot of time just talking about what's going on in the system. That's going to be the majority of this episode, like we typically do. It's crazy right now, man.
It is. It is. I mean, not to get too into the weeds of it, but I've got a full first round plus mock coming out, a 20-round Cubs mock that I've got most of the names pretty solidly locked in, and then we got our midseason re-rank for the prospects, and that's changing on a week by week basis. I mean, we'll get to this guy, but Hayden McGeary a week ago is very different than the Hayden McGeary now, and that's going to totally change. So I'll be honest with everybody. I'm probably going to lock in my 4th of July. I don't care what happens outside of a crazy nuclear event or some kind of injury, knock on wood, that doesn't happen. I'm going to lock it in on the 4th. So if you tell me somebody went crazy for 5 days, I'm just going to tell you that's fine.
Because there's prospects popping up all over the place. And in addition to all this, right, we're recording this on Monday night, July 1st. There are minor league games happening right now. It's the only day of the entire season where the Iowa Cubs, Tennessee Smokies, South Bend Cubs, Myrtle Beach Pelicans play on a Monday. It's the only time this year. They line that up, obviously, because the 4th of July is coming up. And with the 4th of July, they want to hit a home game on the 3rd and the 4th for each team in the series so that there's fireworks and all that good stuff. So weird schedule. So as stuff is happening today, we're going to be talking about some players throughout the day. If there's something crazy, if James Triantos hits for the cycle 2 times over in one game, then we're not going to talk about it today. But just know that it could happen. I don't know. It could be happening right now.
Good. I mean, James has been on a roll.
Exactly.
That wouldn't surprise me.
So
him coming off the bench would make it surprising for that to happen.
You're right. So today's action, what we're talking about today, we're going to get into some Alfonsin Rosario talk, some Cole Roederer talk, one of our favorites here. We're going to talk a lot about starting pitching today and kind of the starting pitchers that follow those top guys in the system and where they kind of fall and what it means for the system. We're going to spend some time with some listener questions, which are heavily geared towards Owen Caissie. We always love talking about Owen Caissie here. And then we'll end the episode by talking draft strategies, some names to watch out for in 2 weeks. So let's kick it off with Alfonsin Rosario, because he has been tremendous so far this year, has one of the best BASH ratings in the entire system this year. He homered again. I believe that was on Saturday that he homered again. And what we're seeing from Alfonsin Rosario, the power numbers that he's put up has been, dare I say, historic during his time in Myrtle Beach as a 20-year-old player.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe I'm thinking of Nelson Velasquez in the Arizona League, but he like popped off like 8 home runs about
Mm-hmm.
the age. But really, to do that in Myrtle Beach is quite impressive. Rosario is a dude that coming from the draft side. So like, brief segue here, but like when I asked about him after the draft, kind of like, hey, this is totally not a name that was anywhere on my radar. Like I didn't have him anywhere near rankings, stuff like that. And everything I got was they're just like, that was a great pick. We did
Yeah.
so much homework on that. And they mentioned the area scout, Melendez, just did everything she needed to. She knew the family, she knew the player, she just knew the ins and outs, and is a huge believer. And I think we're seeing, the justification for that. It's just what he's able to do on the field, but also at an aggressive level. He could have spent the entire year in the complex league, and I don't think we would have like freaked out about it. I think that would have been fine.
Yeah. Yeah, he currently sits sixth. I made a leaderboard. I posted over on Twitter at Out of the Vines that of Myrtle Beach players since 2006, because 2006 is when Fangraphs started kind of doing their minor league leaderboard. So since 2006, players that are 20 years or younger, which Alfonsin Rosario fits in that category, the home run leaderboard, right? And Alfonsin Rosario is currently sixth overall in terms of home runs at Myrtle Beach. The dude's only played 55 games at Myrtle Beach. He's playing if he's in the lineup tonight, he's playing his 56th game. He has 10 home runs so far this year. He's behind Cody Johnson in 2009 as a leader. I'm not familiar with that name, but that dude hit 32 home runs in Myrtle Beach
That's easily.
at the same ballpark. So I don't know what the story was there. All these guys are the same ballpark, but behind guys like Joey Gallo, Kevin Alcantara is actually third on the list. He hit 15 back in 2022. Nick Williams, who was a top prospect coming up, and ended up playing for the Phillies. He was with the Rangers at the time during his time in Myrtle Beach. Miguel Amaya was there in 2019, 11 home runs in 99 games. Alfonsin Rosario, sixth, 10 home runs, 55 games. He has been just showing off the power. Now, obviously, the strikeouts are through the roof. He's striking out, 35% clip or so. That's got to come down. It's actually come down a little bit here and there over the course of the season. That's going to have to come down. But I don't know, dude. We're seeing a lot of these guys that the Cubs have between drafted and signed internationally that have really posted high strikeout rates in the lower minors between Myrtle and the Arizona Complex League. But we still kind of believe in their bats. Like Christian Hernandez was striking out and whiffing a lot down in Arizona. Alexis Hernandez was striking out a lot down in Arizona. We've got I think Cepeda is striking out a little bit, right? In Arizona.
Yeah, he's got a higher K rate.
Joan Delgado is striking out quite a bit, even though he's putting up really good numbers, I believe. Like, there's a lot of guys that are putting up good numbers, but still striking out. And I don't know, even though Alfonso Rosario is striking out a lot, like he still looked pretty damn good at the plate.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to just let him keep working on it as you go up the system. It's interesting because while that's not something that jumps out as like if you were to think about what the Cubs target in different demographics, a guy with like a lot of power and high strikeouts doesn't like jump to mind, or at least it doesn't jump to mind to me. Maybe it does for other people. But if you start thinking about the guys that they've brought in over the last 18 months, honestly, it is a lot of them. And like there's still the benefit of power plays, right? Like Alfonso Rosario is not Nick Madrigal. I know that we are picking two absolute extremes there, but like he's not Nick Madrigal. Nick Madrigal had to hit 300 plus to be a valuable player. Alfonso Rosario does not need to do that if that power keeps progressing like we're showing. Yeah. And so, and what he's shown, at least from what I've seen, has been pretty good in the outfield, in center field. So like, I am pretty impressed with the profile. We have seen, I know we're going to talk about him, we have seen a player get aggressively moved through the system with big power in Owen Caissie, who has actually worked quite well to reduce those numbers. They're not going to be 15% Anthony Rizzo level K rates, but like you get Owen Caissie down to about a 27% K rate, that's going to play. That is completely fine. That is not Joey Gallo. If you kind of keep working on that with Rosario, maybe you get him down to that level. That'll play just.
I mean, I'd argue that it's probably easier to coach and develop strikeouts away than it is to just teach this crazy power and crazy
Yeah.
pop. I think that actually it's funny that I'm saying that because like I think that 3-4 years ago I probably would have said the opposite.
I
I
would
probably
have
would have,
definitely said the opposite. Yeah.
right? Like I think that
Mhm.
like I looked at the guy I go back to in the Cubs system, and it obviously didn't work out in terms of MLB production. He did get a cup of coffee in Chicago. Trent Gimbroni
Oh yeah.
is a guy that like I looked at and I was like, that's a really good example of a guy who knows how to hit. He didn't have any power when he was first drafted and signed. And they're like, let's see if we can tap into some power. The batting average went down, the power went up, and he ended up being a completely different player than he was when he was drafted. I'd almost rather go this route where like it's the Owen Caissie, Alfonsin Rosario route where it's like, yeah, you might whiff a whole lot, but like you have the power there. Let's just work on limiting the strikeouts a little bit more. If you zap some power away from you a little bit more, then that's not great, but like I'd rather take that, I guess, But Christian Hernandez is a good example of that, right? Where he struck out a
Yep.
ton, but he did have some pop. Now he's striking out less this year, and he took away some pop. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a balance, right? Like you'd love a guy that you don't have either of those issues, right? I mean, they're
Yeah,
hitting for power and then they're not striking out. Basically, Anthony Rizzo, right? I mean,
yeah,
Anthony Rizzo was on an absolutely incredible track of walking a ton, not striking out, hitting for power. That's like the dream. That's the dream profile. And you don't see a ton of guys like that in the majors, and they're all stars. So,
mm-hmm.
like, ideally, you're getting those kind of players. But if you can't do that, then it is a balance.
Yep.
And gambling on the tools, especially power tools, is not a bad way to play it, especially when, they do have some guys in the system that that do have kind of the opposite profile. Like we
Yeah.
talked about James Toronto's. James Toronto's is hitting really well. He's starting to tap into some pole side power. So I don't want to say he's not showing power, but like it's still like probably a plus hit tool with like an average power profile. And that kind of balance is
You got
like
to develop all types of players,
got to develop all.
and the major league team over the past few years has not done that, right? We've been
Right.
complaining about how they transitioned into the Nico and Madrigal and guys like that. That
Yeah.
was too contact oriented. You got to have a lineup that has all of the different types of players to be successful, in my opinion.
Yeah. You got to hit the 3-run home run sometimes, and you got to get the 2-out RBI,
Yep.
ground out to the right side.
Let's go from a guy in Myrtle Beach at 20 years old to a guy who seems like he's been in the organization for about 20 years, and that is Cole Roederer, because he is riding a heater right now,
He is.
and it's worth pointing out and kind of talking about what we want to see or could possibly see from Cole Roederer moving forward. I've got his numbers pulled up from since June 20th. So this is the last, not including Monday night's game if he's in the lineup. This is his last 41 plate appearances, 9 games. He is slashing 306 batting average. He's got an OBP of 390. He's got a slug of 667. That's an OPS over 1,000. He's got 3 home runs. He's got 4 doubles. That's a lot of extra bases in a 9-game stretch. He has been terrific, all while hitting leadoff for the Iowa Cubs. He is the leadoff man right now, playing center field every day for the Iowa Cubs. It's we've talked about Cole plenty on this podcast over the years, right? Dating back to the show with Jimmy, we've talked a
Yeah.
lot about Cole Roederer, and he's deserved it for different reasons, right? He deserved it when he was first drafted because he was an exciting prospect. He then was young, playing in full season ball. He deserved it then. Then we kind of talked about the quirkiness that is his personality, and we love talking about that as enjoying him as a person. And then he got hurt, and now he's coming back, and he's kind of earned his way back to playing every day in Iowa, which is like exactly what we wanted to see. Cole Roederer he's kind of carved out a little role for himself.
I think so too. And I mean, he's always carried the type of profile of a guy that I don't want to say at worst, like this isn't his floor because that's really not a fair thing to say about almost any player. But like the profile of, hey, even if he is not a starter caliber or better player, that he's a really good 4th outfielder type guy, a guy that carries value on defense, a guy that carries value at the plate, and still some. I mean, I kind of watch it and I see still untapped potential.
Yeah.
I think I can't remember if it was on this podcast, maybe it was the original one with you and Jimmy, but I kind of comped him to Andrew Benintendi.
Yeah.
And it was very, very similar profile. Now, obviously, injuries came up. We had a COVID season in there. It's very
A lot has
different.
changed
A
since then.
lot has changed since then. I don't think it's that. But like that type of a profile where the value is there. And I like what I'm seeing from Benintendi. I haven't been able to watch it on a game-by-game basis, but when I do tune in, it's like he's showing you kind of what we were always hoping for.
Yeah, the thing with Cole, the fourth, fifth outfielder, whatever you want to call it, situation for him is it's set up perfectly for him. Will he? We're not sitting here arguing that Cole Roederer is going to be an all-star outfielder at the major league level. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is his path to being a contributor on a major league roster is kind of there for the taking for him, right? He is a left-handed hitting outfielder. So he can play the strong side of a platoon where he's hitting against right-handed pitchers. There's more right-handed pitchers than left-handed pitchers.
Yep.
He can play all three outfield positions. He can play all three very well. I'd argue. I think he's good in center field. I think he's great in left field, and I think he can play right field if you need him to. The arm isn't quite there, but like all three positions, I think he'd be good at in the major leagues. He's got some speed on the base. He's not going to go out there and even in a full season steal you 25 bags, but he can run the base as well. He can steal you a bag or two. Like the profile is right to be a fourth outfielder. Now he needs to continue to prove that he can hit in Iowa and continue doing this.
Yeah.
I was trying to pull up his splits in terms of versus righties and versus lefties. He is better against this season. This season he's better. He's got an OPS a little over 100 points higher against righties and lefties. So like that plays. That's what you want to see. I don't know, man. I look at Cole Roederer and a lot of this depends on, and this is the conversation that we're going to be having for the next 4 weeks, but what the Cubs major league roster looks like after the trade deadline. We'll know more. We'll know more after the trade deadline. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But say the Cubs get themselves in a situation where they're a full seller at the deadline, right? They're selling off. Cole Roederer is a good example of a guy that like could slot in as a fourth outfielder if a Happ were to be traded or a Bellinger to be traded or whatever the situation is. I think he might fit himself well onto a Cubs roster later this season potentially.
I mean, I think the archetype for that exact player is Mike Tauchman.
Yeah.
And if Mike Tauchman finds himself on a different club or continues having injury issues, which are very real, and I know he's battling that right now. We're like the archetype for what Cole Roederer, the type of career that he could carve out, is Mike Tauchman.
Yeah,
and you can see him go on a heater sometimes, and Mike Tauchman gets some ire, and I think maybe unfairly because it was ride or die with him last year, which that's not a fair thing to put on that guy. But I think in general, he's produced more than you would have expected. And so he's had some positive contributions, solid in center field, better in the corners. And like, that's probably what you'd see maybe with Roederer being good in center and very good in the corners, but still that same kind of idea. I think Mike Tauchman's the kind of role and a guy who should play a really long time. I don't think that Cole necessarily needs to go overseas to play to earn that spot back. I mean, it's all about timing, but that's the type of player that I could see Cole Roederer doing and being a really damn good pro.
It's funny because we've seen Cole go from being a top 10 prospect early on during his time in the system to being outside the top 50 prospects in the system, right? He was outside the top 50 guys in the system. And I think that now he's kind of like, he was way up here, he was way down here, and I think he's kind of found a home in terms of the prospect rankings, right somewhere in the middle, which is perfect for the role that he could potentially carve out in Chicago. Or in the major leagues. It's wild, the roller coaster ride that he's been on, but I'm glad he's kind of settled where he has. Let's transition to starting pitchers because I shot you a text earlier today. I was like, hey, like any specific topics you want to talk about? You mentioned starting pitchers. I put out a question out on Twitter and said, hey, does anybody have any listener questions? We'll try to approach them. Ryan responded right away and he goes, hey, you should talk about you should talk about starting pitchers and kind of the guys after the top guys in the system. I was like, that's perfect. That's what we're planning on talking about. Let's talk about the depth, and we'll mention specific players throughout this conversation. But I want to look at it from the lens of like what this system looks like as a whole in terms of starting pitchers. We've talked in this podcast plenty about relievers. We talked about Arias and Biggie and Lee and Scalzo and all those guys a lot. We're not talking about those guys today. The guys that either are relievers now or might profile as relievers for sure. We're talking about starting pitcher prospects, and we're not talking about Cade Horton because we talked about him plenty. We know where Cade Horton fits. Even though he's injured right now, we know what Cade Horton is. Even Jackson Wiggins. I think that Jackson Wiggins is clearly the second best starting pitcher prospect in this organization, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a quick note on Wiggins is that he's exactly where you want him to be right now. Showing better control than I thought coming into this. This stuff is big. The Cubs made a big play for him, very similar to how they made a big play for Horton. And I think Wiggins is showing you exactly what you want. So, to hit to Ryan's question and to what I definitely wanted to get at, it's not the top guys. It's not Cade Horton and Jackson Wiggins. It's the next group, the wave that shows you some flashes, but then has a lot more questions. And I do want to note this before we go any further, is that we're a prospect podcast. This is what we're focused on. But like the Major League Club does get a lot of flack right now. And believe me, it's deserved. But one of the things that I think folks lose sight of is that there is more good homegrown pitching that has been on the Major League roster for the Cubs now since I think I went back to about 2004.
Mm-hmm.
And from even a stats perspective, it's really good. Like I put this out on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it. And like, that's a good line. And it's heavily Ben Brown and it's heavily Justin Steele. They all count. So like the Cubs have done a good job developing pitchers. They're not done, but they've done a good job. And they've got guys like Cade Horton who are very close, hopefully, coming back from injury. And then they're very close to being done developing. And they've got another guy who could progress quickly in Jackson Wiggins. But then there's this group of arms that, I mean, I know we'll talk about players. I see flashes. There are certain guys I'm definitely excited about, but there are still a lot of questions. And with pitching development, I know our listeners know this, but like you have to develop in mass, right? Like you have to have so many guys. 2 years ago, we were looking at Hayden Wisniewski and being like, that's your number 3 starter.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan Wicks, injuries have happened, inconsistencies have happened. This is how Major League Baseball pitching works. You very rarely have a guy step in like Paul Skeens and just take the world on fire. You almost always need to have this massive amount of pitching and then kind of navigate it along the way.
You have to have not just 2 guys stashed in Iowa. You have to have 2 guys stashed in the Chicago bullpen that can eat innings in a rotation. You have to have 2 guys in the Iowa bullpen that can eat innings in Chicago. You have to have an entire entire rotation of guys in the Iowa rotation that can eat innings. You have to have so much depth. And that is not going to come by having 7 guys that are potential 2 or 3 starters. That's going to come from guys that like profile as like a number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8 starter, right? And so after Cade and after Jackson Wiggins, I'd probably make the argument that Will Sanders is the third best pitching prospect in the organization. However, you have about 10 other dudes that I'd listen to an argument are the 4th or 5th best pitcher in the organization.
Yeah.
I listen to an argument that Naz Mule is the 4th best starting pitcher in the organization. I'd listen to an argument that Brandon Birdsell is. I listen to an argument that Connor Noland or Arian Rodriguez or Juan Bay or Drew Gray, take your pick. And I wouldn't call you crazy for arguing for it. You know what I mean? And so I think the big thing is that group is not super inspiring. I'm not looking at any of those guys and saying that's the next Cade Horton or Jackson Wiggins. They're not, and I don't think they have to be. What needs to happen is I need to continue to see more development out of these guys to give me confidence that they can be good in Iowa. I need to see good in Iowa, and if I can get good in Iowa, then I kind of trust the Cubs development staff to get those guys from Iowa to Chicago. I just need to see them in Iowa first, right? Like I need to see Brody McCullough get healthy and come back and go to Iowa. I need to see Juan Bello and Arian Rodriguez, who were younger guys when they were drafted or when they were signed or drafted. I need to see them. I need to see one of them. The likelihood that you're going to get both of those guys as number 3 starters in Iowa is pretty low. But I need one of those guys to hit. I want one of those guys to hit, you know? So I don't know. It's just it's a weird grouping of pitchers after that. And ultimately we'll get into how that like impacts the draft. I think that might transition well to later in the show, but like, there's not impact starters in Chicago or in the Cubs system after Cade and Jackson Wiggins, in my opinion. Even Will Sanders, who I really like Will Sanders. I think Will Sanders could be something. But I think I kind of view Will Sanders as Connor Nolan, Brandon Birdsell, but better, if that makes sense. Like I'm not putting expectations of Brandon Birdsell or Connor Nolan to be a number 3 or number 4 starter in Chicago. I think that's a silly expectation. I think that Will Sanders could get there, but I think that he's just like a better version of Nolan and Birdsell in terms of like a profile, not in terms of the way they pitch, but in terms of a profile and expectations.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit more bullish on Sanders just because I followed him so closely with the draft, to be honest, last year. And he was somebody that I looked at where I thought he was going to be like a top 40 pick entering the year. And then he didn't. He had some injuries. If you look at him from a physical development standpoint, I'm very curious what he looks like next summer.
Yeah.
Because he looks like he could put on a lot of good muscle.
I agree with that.
You know, and that's easier said than done, right? Like there's genetics and there's a lot of hard work that goes into that. You don't just put somebody into a machine, Captain America style, and they come out right there. But just super projectable frame, but already kind of showing you what you want to see. But I don't want to get ahead of myself because I agree with what you're saying. He's showing it at high A, which is good. But like there's some steps to go, right? Like if he's doing the same thing in Double A, and if you look at his stats, by the way, if you know, I'm sure our listeners are pretty cued in on Will Sanders, but if you're just kind of getting into this, or maybe the major league team is frustrating, and you're just trying to like, you know what, let me just look at these prospects. People talk about the Cubs prospects. Let me just look into that and find some solace.
Yeah.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to talk. We're going to be your comfort blanket here as we go forward in all likelihood. But you know, if you're not as familiar with Will Sanders, like he is a guy that if you just looked up his stats, they don't jump off the table for you, right? Like, but he just had 2 rough outings at the beginning, and since then has looked really good. That's very normal in the minor league, so we don't really worry about that too much.
I'm glad you brought up stats because I think it's really interesting, this grouping of players. And if we put out a question on Twitter, like who are your 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th best pitching prospects, pitching prospects in the system, we would get so many different answers, but you would be able to tell who is following stat lines, which is fine, which I promise it's fine. That's fine to do. And who is not paying as much attention to stat lines, and who is just like who's at the games, who's watching the games and not paying as much attention to stat lines. Because you have Drew Gray and Will Sanders, who I would argue are probably my 3rd and 4th pitching prospects
those are my
in the system.
3 and 4 too. Yeah.
Those guys, you got Will Sanders with an ERA of 4.10. You got Drew Gray with an ERA of 6.03. On the other hand, I think that people that follow the stat lines, which again is totally fine, I think people that follow the stat lines are going to look at Ty Johnson and Nick Dean, and they're going to say, Well, those guys, Ty Johnson has an ERA of, or sorry, I was looking at XFIP. I'm so sorry. I was looking at XFIP when I was reading off those numbers before. Hold on.
Embarrassing.
I'm embarrassed to be reading off XFIP. Will Sanders ERA 4.94, even worse.
Okay, yeah, 4.1 did seem a little,
yeah,
a little low.
4.94 for ERA for Will Sanders. Drew Gray 5.18. So even worse. I mean, like Drew Gray's better, but like bad numbers.
Yeah,
then you go to ERA for like Ty Johnson 4.06 with a 3.08 xFIP, and then Nick Dean with a 2.14 ERA. And people are like, those are the guys. That's 3 and 4 right there.
Yeah.
And it's just different. Like those are guys that were in low A and now high A college arms, just like Will Sanders was. You know what I mean? And so like it's you can probably tell who focuses or who pays more attention to certain elements of prospect following based on who they rank as 3, 4, 5, 6. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, totally. Or honestly, just watching the games and like having zero concept of any of it. And I bet we would get, if we asked this question, who's your 3, 4, 5? I'm guessing a lot of people would pick like 3, 4. They'd pick some of the same guys. I bet we'd get somebody random.
Yeah.
Not somebody that we wouldn't know. We would know them, but like somebody that you're like, oh, I would not have imagined that. Just because watching it, or maybe you sat in on a game and you watched a guy just like, K5 in 3 innings, and you're like, this is a dude. It is the beauty of minor league baseball and prospects and development, and the fact that it's not linear. But yeah, I mean, I think Greg and I tend to think very similarly on a lot of players. It's that there can be a lot of differences.
Who would, I mean, putting you on the spot here a little bit, and you can talk through it a little bit too. Who would you rank higher between Connor Noland, one very like he's been around, like people know his name, versus like let's say Arian Rodriguez, who has kind of popped up on the radars a lot more recently. Like I'd probably rank. Oh, I don't know actually. I'd probably rank Connor Noland, but like how much of that is just like I recognize the name more? I know I'm digging into these guys a lot, but like
maybe. So Arian Rodriguez, I had the area scout reach out the morning that they signed him in 2021 or 22. I can't remember. I was in Oregon. I think it would have been 2021. And was just so excited about that. I guess maybe it was 2022. Sorry. But she was just so excited that they got this dude, and they did a ton of due diligence on him. But he was definitely always viewed, I don't want to speak for the Cubs, but he was always viewed externally as like a guy that he's going to take a couple years, but then he could really pop. Yeah. He would be the day 3 guy that you're looking at and you're like, where the hell did they get this guy from? A 13th, 14th rounder. And Arian Rodriguez was always viewed that way. So I will say it's a bit of clouding my judgment on that. But this is a great question, because we're about to do our re-rank, and I've not gotten this deep yet. Yeah. But like, I think I would probably have Arian higher, because I do value the ceiling. I do value the ceiling at that point.
I can say I have not gotten that deep. I've been focused on the top 7 guys, trying to figure out where the heck I'm ranking the top 7 dudes. That's crazy. That's a conversation we'll have after our rankings come out, is those top 7 guys. But yeah, it's a toss up. All these guys, right? Choose between Arian Rodriguez and Connor Noland. Choose between Juan Bello and Brandon Birdsell. Choose between Connor Noland and Brandon Birdsell. It's so difficult. It's just a grouping, and I think like as people who are following the prospects in the Cubs system as closely as we are, we just want guys to stand out more. I don't want to look at these 12 guys and say, I don't know, they're just all about the same.
4 or 5 are.
I don't want them to be the same. I want guys to step up and stand out. And for my purpose, to make life easier on me for rankings, some guys to just identify themselves as not legit. You know what I mean? Like I want some more variation between these guys, and then be surprised if Ty Johnson takes off, or be surprised if Nick Dean stays legit. Yeah. But it's an interesting conversation to have. I love to get your guys' thoughts. If you want to tweet at us, if you want to drop some comments down in the YouTube chat below, who are your guys that are kind of next in line after Cade Horton and Jackson Wiggins? Because it's difficult. You're looking at 2 guys, you're listening to 2 guys that are coming out with rankings next week, and we don't know. We don't know how to rank them, So I don't know. Any more thoughts on that?
No, the thing about the in-season rankings too is that I don't shop those rankings around. So like in the off-season ones, I'll kick some names out to people in the Cubs and outside the Cubs. I don't do that in season. It gets confusing. It gets cloudy. People are not trying to tell you stuff because they may want to target that guy in a trade, et cetera, or whatever. Or the Cubs want to keep that name off the list. So like, this is just all me. And so if you want to pick a ranking that you just look at and you're like, well, that's dumb. Honestly, that's the beauty of it. I would advise everybody, if you're kind of getting into this, there's no pressure to do it. It's all for fun, but like try to create one of your own little rankings on your own and just see how it matches up in a year see how it matches up by the end of the season. Because I think it'll be pretty surprising.
I have a spreadsheet of all of my rankings over the past 8 years that I've been doing rankings, whatever it is. And I've changed up how I've done my rankings, right? I used to do them that it was I would do a arms list and a bats list. I used to do it where I wouldn't rank any guys who I hadn't seen on MLB TV, where it was like they had to be from Eugene at the time up. I have then transitioned into where I was ranking guys all the way down to like the Dominican Summer League. And now I'm kind of getting away from that again, where I'm like, I will not rank a guy unless he's stateside. So like those rankings have changed over the years in terms of the styles in which I've done them. But one of these days I'm going to put together an article and looking back, I'm going to call myself out and look back on some of my rankings in the past. And really in doing that, it's fun because you'd be surprised at some of how the system stacked up when at the time you're like, this system kind of sucks. It's like, all right, well, they've ended up producing 11 major leaguers or whatever it might be. Yeah. I'm thinking of some of those like real down years, and now they weren't major leaguers that ended up making a super big impact in the major leagues, but like they made the major leagues, and that's a big thing. So make a prospect list, whether you post it somewhere or not. Like make a prospect list based on the stats you're looking at, based on us talking on this podcast. Guys you identify with, guys that you see highlights, and you're like, you know what? I think that like that highlight's really fun. Let me bump them up a few notches. Like, I make a ranking. It's fun. Yeah. It's a fun thing to do, and I will say that like I put a lot of time into properly ranking them. I put a lot of time into writing it and workshopping everything. But at the same time, like I probably put less stock into that in terms of like, oh man, I didn't get it right. I should have ranked a guy 3 slots higher. I put less stock into it in terms of that than I do some of these podcast episodes we do. I do more like not more research, but like I want to be sure I'm saying the right thing on the show versus the list. Is like I know the list is going to get people wrong. I know it is because that's the nature of the beast with that. So I don't know. It's a fun thing to do, man.
It is a fun thing to do, and honestly, like there's no pressure in it too. You just have to kind of just roll with it because, I mean, I think we spend a lot of time on these things, in general, like or just watching the games, watching the players, kind of diving into it, whether we spend the time on the rankings, specifically writing them or whatever. But like post 2022, I got yelled at so bad about 2 players that I had ranked. One, I believe, was Kevin Made third, which fair. Yeah, I was aggressive there. It didn't really play off. The second that I got so yelled at that he was like 8 spots too high was PCA at 2.
That he was too high?
That he was too high. I picked him at 2, and I got told that I was very, very silly by people on Twitter. And so just like, that's the fun of it. Who cares? Like I had 2 complete polar opposites that I got really right and really wrong. And it's the players playing. Like it doesn't matter.
Sometimes you rank Reggie Preciado above PCA. Sometimes that happens,
Sometimes it happens.
Just not me, of course. Just sometimes it happens. All right, man. Anything else on the pitching prospects? We can move on to some Owen Caissie.
I think that we'll get to the draft impact here later. But I think it's just one of those things where, from an organization standpoint, they do have to have this in mind, though. And I think it will. The fact that we see a couple guys at the top, and then some other guys that are interesting but have more question marks, will prompt some organization decision making. That doesn't mean it's necessarily in draft, at the trade deadline, or in the offseason. but I think it will have some impact because the Cubs have debuted a whole bunch of guys at the majors. And that's, in general, like I mentioned, the stats actually look pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still then there's that other wave. There's like a middle wave that you don't really have. You got some guys, but in that like high A, double A, or soon to be triple A, it's not quite there with as much depth as you want. And so, I think it'll have some impact.
Yeah. I what I always like to point out is that a Major League Baseball team will never, ever, ever, ever draft a player based on the needs at the major league level. It will never, ever happen. However, what does sometimes happen is a team drafting a player or players throughout a draft, which I think is more likely the scenario with the Cubs in this draft class. Draft a position where there is not much depth in the minor league system, right? For example, starting pitching, there's not a whole lot of really good depth, so you might just go the approach where you're drafting multiple starting pitchers that one of them might hit and start to improve some of that depth. So you can draft based on need in your system as a whole, not based on the major league level. So I
don't want to critique too much. I will echo pretty much everything you said with one exception. That is, people have no idea what the LA Angels are doing some years because they literally do just draft for their major league need and get these guys to the majors within like 2 months. But outside of that extreme outlier, I think we can safely say the Cubs are not going to look at things and say, we need a third baseman. We need a catcher. Or a catcher. Yeah. We are going to take a catcher in the first round. That is the answer. If our top guy isn't there, we're taking our second best guy.
Yeah.
That is not going to happen. So, or if you sit there and say, we should trade Ian Happ despite his no trade clause, and draft, a left field, that's probably not going to happen. But as we segue, if we do want to start talking about outfielders who may come up from the minor leagues and make a major league impact, I think it's time that we talk about where Owen Caissie is.
Yeah. So when I put out the question on Twitter to see who could send in some listener questions for us to talk about, we got 3 different responses asking about Owen Caissie type questions. So I'll read these off. They're all Owen Caissie related. We got a question from John Flayton asking, do you feel it would make more sense chemistry-wise to call up Owen Caissie to play left field and just go ahead and trade Ian Happ? From Logan, he asked, has Owen Caissie earned a call up to the show yet? And from Jordan K, asked, how can the Cubs discover how high the ceiling is on their top prospects without trading Happ, Seiya, or Nico? So that's less Owen Caissie specific, but I think it still relates to him. I think we can kind of address these as a whole. And I'll lead off by saying something I said earlier in the show, in that we will know more about all of this. We'll know more about the how does Owen Caissie fit in with Ian Happ and Seiya Suzuki out there? How do we know about the ceiling of some of these guys if Nico or Seiya or Happ is not traded? All of that stuff. We will know more come what do we say? Come July 31st, because the trade deadline is July 30th, right? Yep. We will know more come July 31st on where these kind of players fall based on are the Cubs buying, are the Cubs selling, are the Cubs doing something in between? We'll find out more then. So it's tough to say. I'm not going to sit here and say Owen Caissie will be up on August 1st because it probably depends on what's going on in Chicago.
Yeah.
I'll kick it to you first to just kind of address Owen Caissie as a whole based on those questions.
Yeah. So I think what Owen showed you, they briefly tried him in center field. I don't think he's a center fielder, but I really don't think he's bad in the outfield, which is really, really impressive. And I think we just, for some brief context here, I know we've talked about it on the podcast before, but like Owen Caissie played baseball in Canada. And where he played baseball in Canada, the majority of his practice and his experience and his reps were done inside where he was fielding fly balls. Like, then he went out to the Arizona sun. And then he went out to windy conditions in South Bend and Myrtle Beach.
And Myrtle Beach, yeah.
And like, that is not an easy place to play. He has really made tremendous strides to the point that I think he's a pretty solid outfielder. Mm-hmm. The question always comes up of like, well, should he play first base? And, I don't know the answers to that too. Maybe increasing versatility. But in general, he has done the work to make himself a pretty good outfielder.
And a more valuable player because of that,
yes,
instead of being banished to first base.
Absolutely. I mean, there were folks that were like, this guy's just a DH. Just bring him up, let him DH. And slowly roll. Like, this guy was 20, 21 years old playing against very advanced competition. Mm-hmm. The other thing that Owen Caissie has really done, despite some maybe prominent national writers who continue to, they have their opinions on this, but it doesn't quite match up, say is that he has addressed his whiff percentage very significantly. Owen Caissie, especially in the in-zone whiff percentage, has improved dramatically. And that is huge for his profile. He is not a finished product. He is not going to be a guy. Again, I brought up Anthony Rizzo as a good example of a guy who hits for power but actually doesn't strike out a lot in his career overall. Owen Caissie's just not going to be that guy. He is going to still generate some Ks, but you're willing to live with it because he also generates more power, more loft, and an added slug and ISO, isolated power. And so you're willing to kind of play with that. But that being said, Caissie has really dramatically improved his strikeout percentage and done so, maybe this is even more impressive to me, against a lot of crafty left-handers in AAA. And so there were questions that Owen Caissie had entering the year, namely defense, the ability to make contact when needed, and just that overall profile that I wouldn't say he's like sufficiently answered all these questions, but he's certainly taken a lot of steps to help address them to the point that I feel very, very good about what Owen Caissie projects long-term. I don't know that he's ever an all-star, but I do look at him as a guy that is a very good player. Can probably play a few different positions, do so pretty well, and then generate a lot of value for you. I think he is close. I don't think he is somebody that you immediately bring up to the majors. But I do think that if we look at things in the next 12 months, that Owen Caissie is likely playing in the big leagues and working through that development.
I think that if you called up Owen Caissie right now, it wouldn't be egregious. It wouldn't be like, oh, like, what are you doing calling him up? But the way that I like to look at it is if Ian Happ, Seiya Suzuki, Cody Bellinger, Pete Crow Armstrong, if those guys were all performing well, like really well in Chicago, would we be looking at Owen Caissie and being like, man, we just got to find a spot for him in Chicago? And I think the answer is no. I think if the slots were truly filled by really good performances in Chicago, I don't think we'd be saying like man, like we got to find a way somehow for Owen Caissie. And because of that, like, let's just wait until he's like really ready. Like, I think he's been very good. Do I think that he's like really ready? No, like he'll get there soon. He may get there before the end of the year, but I don't think he's there right now. I am perfectly content, no matter what the Cubs look like at the major league level. Perfectly content with Owen Caissie spending the year in AAA, and I don't think it'll be a bad thing. I don't think it's bad if he does that. I think if he starts next year, I think it would be weird if he played the rest of the year in Iowa, didn't touch Chicago, and then started opening day in Chicago next year. That'd be a little weird, right? Like, because you'd like to get him some sort of like taste of the major league level before starting off the year next year in Chicago. But I think that'd be a fine approach. I think that'd be, again, not egregious if they went that route. Not egregious if he started off the first few weeks in 2025 in Iowa again, depending on what he does at the end of this year, obviously. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's just I think it's fine that he's in Iowa right now.
Yeah, I really have no issues with it. I get DMs about it all the time, folks, and I get it. I totally hear what you're saying, but also I don't have a problem with him continuing to play in Iowa. I certainly don't think he's a guy that you call up as a Hail Mary, last ditch. We've got to try to save this Cubs season. That just doesn't make any sense to me. Those type of things almost never work. And so, don't do that. Just develop the guys how you're going to develop. If the Cubs season is going to be lost because Owen Caissie doesn't come up in the next month, then honestly, the Cubs season is lost. And that's completely on other factors than Owen Caissie. Let him develop and do it. Let him force the issue is the term I keep using. Let these guys force the issue. The best teams in baseball let their prospects force the issue. And then when the good ones really, really do, guess what? They're making the room for it. So like there's another guy we didn't even talk about, but I had people that were saying like, you got to be kidding me. He's getting at bats. He's keeping Owen Caissie down. And it was Mike Tauchman, who we talked about earlier. Mike Tauchman is not preventing the Cubs from bringing up Owen Caissie. Owen Caissie developing, as he should, which has been pretty good, is what's keeping him down. It has nothing to do with Mike Tauchman. And now the fact that he's injured, renders that moot. But like, that's the whole thing. They will find space for these guys.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't, then they can trade them. I'm not saying that they're going to trade Caissie. I'm just saying in general, there's a common thing right now where I get folks that are like, you've got Happ, you've got Suzuki, you've got Bellinger, you've got PCA, whatever, Tauchman, whatever. And it's like, you're never going to find at bats for all these guys. And at the end of the day, the best teams in baseball have more really good players that need at bats than they do spots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And right now, the Cubs do not have a high enough talent level that they have that situation. So, like, just let it play out, get it the best players you can on the field. That's really all you can ask for.
Yep.
At some point, yes, they need to develop, bring these guys to the majors. But I'm not concerned about that.
The Cubs front office would find a way when Owen Caissie is ready to be the starting outfielder in Chicago. They'd find a way to make it work. They'd find a way to get rid of Ian Happ, even though he has a no trade clause. Like they'd work. Something would happen. Mike Tauchman would not be on whatever it might be. If Owen Caissie right now was going full James Wood, Owen Caissie would be in Chicago. That's what it comes down to. All right, man. We're running through this episode pretty quick. We've covered a lot of stuff. Let's transition from current Cubs prospects to potential future Cubs prospects. My Wi-Fi is crapping out a little bit. Hopefully, I'm coming through all right.
Did kind of notice that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's. I'm gonna kick it to you then. Give you the chance to talk. We're talking draft. The draft is in 2 weeks, like we mentioned earlier. I want to get your thoughts on specific players that let's focus first on the first round, right? First round is the round that everyone's paying the most attention to. What names are you seeing right around the Cubs pick at 14 that could potentially go to the Chicago Cubs?
Well, I think if I were to drop a strategy for the Cubs and hold with me on this kind of a bold strategy, I want the Cubs to draft good players. I know it's surprising. But, all glib comments aside, what I'm trying to get at is they're drafting 14th overall. And you should feel pretty good about the guy that you're taking at 14. I'll actually lump in. So I'll say, let's focus a little bit of time talking about 14 and 54, because that's the first 2 rounds. And in many ways, I do believe that those picks will be linked very closely. From talking to people inside, outside, the Cubs are not tipping their hands in any way, shape, or form, but just trying to piece stuff together. And definitely from people outside and how that all goes about, I do believe the first 2 selections are going to be somewhat linked. And so if they go with a guy at full slot, a quick refresher, the top 10 rounds of the Major League Baseball first-year player draft, there are slot values. And so you get a set amount of money based on the picks that you're picking. You do not have to give that set amount of money. So it's not I feel like the NFL and a few of the other leagues have similar things. And I know there's some wiggle room, but they kind of have basically these are the contracts you're getting. There's not this guy is.
In the NFL, if a guy gets drafted in the first round at pick number 14, he's got an assigned pick slot value of $2.5 million. If the team wants to sign him, they give him $2.5 million. Perfect. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Yeah,
love it. Okay, yeah. So that makes perfect sense then. That was my perception, but I'm not super cued in on the NFL draft. So that's how other leagues have it. Baseball doesn't have that. They have basically recommendations. But that being said, within your 10 rounds, you basically do need to adhere to it, because if you don't, you start losing first round picks in subsequent drafts. And while that's been floated in the past of like some team blowing out their draft and then just taking a whole bunch of first rounders in like the 7th round, it hasn't happened yet. And if it was going to happen, it was probably going to happen with the Mets. They haven't done it. So basically, teams don't anticipate that's going to happen anytime soon with the current CBT rules. CBA rules, sorry. And so you've got a set amount of money, and you basically have like slot money for this. And within that, there's some wiggle room, but you're likely going to have some kind of flexibility. So for instance, the Cubs' first round pick is approximately $5 million, and the second round is about $1.6 million. Where they may go about it is the decision of, do we take a guy that we feel like is one of the top 15 players, give him that $5 million, and then for that second round, take a guy who's probably maybe a smidge over that, and then borrow money from later. So maybe they get like a $5 million player and a $2 million player. And at some point, it's just, do we just take two really good, the two best players that we have on our board at the time? I don't know the answer, but I think that that's one of the decisions. And the other decision that's coming around right now is for the Cubs, and this I've heard from external folks, is that they're at least talking to some players or having some conversations. Maybe I don't want to make it too strong, but having some thoughts about taking a guy who might be a little bit of an underslot. So somebody that maybe you pay $4 million of it, you bank that $1 million for that next pick. And if you work the money around, it kind of works out that you can effectively give a $4 million bonus to a guy and a $3 million bonus to a guy at 54. You have to be creative, but there's some flexibility. The math works. And so you might get like 2 first-round guys and how that all goes about. So
That's very similar. Like that's what the Cubs did a couple years back when they drafted Cade Horton and Jackson Ferris. They signed Cade Horton for underslot. They signed Jackson Ferris for overslot. They essentially got 2 guys that were back into the first round talent. Like at the time, Cade Horton's been better, but at the time, we're back into the first round talents in terms of signing money wise. If that makes sense, right? So then you're allotting your money different. So instead of getting a guy that's a 14th pick talent, quote unquote talent, and a fit, what do we have, 53rd round,
54,
54th overall pick talent, maybe you're getting a 28 and a 31.
Yeah, absolutely. Could totally be that. And if you want to look at 2 different drafts with that same type of strategy, you've got 2022, like you mentioned, that's Horton and Ferris, and that's exactly what they did. They saved money on Horton, they spent up on Ferris. Almost the exact money-wise too, believe it or not, with what we were just talking about, just weird quirk on that. And then if you compare that to 2021, well, Jordan Wicks just kind of fell in their lap. They weren't anticipating he was going to be there. And so they just took him. I think that might have been at 21 overall or something like that. They just took him because that was silly. He was a guy that was in their like top 10 or, maybe top 12 or something like that. So they just took him. And then they borrowed a bunch of money from later, and then they spent up on James Giantos. Mm-hmm. I still think we see an overslot in the second round. I do. I think that they are going to be targeted a little bit more on the upside. And so we can get to those guys in a second. Where that decision-making comes up at 14 is, okay, so who do you take in the first round? And I want to be very clear that the numbers I'm tossing out are something that I would approximate for these guys. I am not talking to advisors. I do not know what the asks of these players are. I know very clearly that there are many players who have not even defined their ask. That is very common. Some don't even do it until the day of the draft. Some don't even do it until day 2 or day 3 of the draft. They will change that. And so these numbers I'm tossing out are not because I've talked to the advisor for like Malcolm Moore or anything like that.
For what it's worth, I'm an open book on my ask. So if a scout wants to ask me, they can they can give me a call.
That sounds good. Honestly, if you could be a senior slot saver, I think that there would be a lot of value in that. But so when we talk about 14, there's a few names that I do think we should pay attention to a little bit more. Some of them have more buzz than others, but honestly, this is a bad time of year for that. So we just finished the College World Series when a few players played on the national stage, got a ton of press, got a ton of buzz. And it's really hard to, like, if they performed, it's really hard to then compare that to guys that their teams just didn't, they lost earlier in the playoffs. Well, that's not, for instance, let's compare Vance Honeycutt, who is the center fielder for UNC and had a really good tournament. He played really, really well. He made himself a lot of money. And then compare that to fellow outfielder, Oklahoma State University, Carson Bench. Bench played really well, and he was getting a lot of buzz before that. His team didn't make it, but it's not like the guy has to be LeBron James and carry the entire team. That's not how we evaluate players, and that's just not how baseball works. And so I think that there's a few players whose buzz maybe wasn't as strong, whereas these are guys that are still on the Cubs' radar, or at least from what I've gathered. And so, guys like Vance Honeycutt, I do think are. I have some very real questions with regard to his overall profile, his whiffs, his chase. I do have some questions, but the ceiling is very high. If you can address something with regard to whiffs and chases, we are talking about an all-star center fielder. Like the power is there, the speed is there, the defense is there. It is very impressive.
It comes full circle a little bit with our conversation about the Cubs trying to cut down on strikeouts. And
yeah, I almost brought up Vance Honeycutt during that, and I thought, no. Once I get on draft stuff, I'm not going to stop. So I'm at least self-aware enough to not do that. But Vance Honeycutt's rocking a 68, 69% contact rate. That's not good, and it's not good in college. And we have some questions on his chase rate as well. The profile is still very, very loud, and I do think that he's a name on the Cubs board that they would be looking at. But also a guy like Carson Bench, I just want to compare him. I don't know how he ranks on the Cubs board or anything like that, but I do want to compare him to Honeycutt, where, I don't know that he's a center fielder, but he's pretty good in outfield. Great from a contact perspective, great from a chase perspective, solid exit velocity, solid bat spin, stuff like that. And so those would be two of the outfielders that I'd be looking at. There's also, from the college side, I think we can't go too far without mentioning the pitching aspect. And the guy that I definitely want to cue in on is the guy that I've been talking about since last December. That's Trey Savage. When I mocked him to the Cubs in December, I think he was 36 on Pipeline. He's 10th now.
I was going to say, now it seems more and more likely that it's going to be tough to see Trey Savage down at 14. He may not make it down to 14.
It would be one of those where it's boy, that's a blessing, kind of a thing of not we're reaching for this guy. Definitely not of a reach. Clear SP3 in the college class. And I've talked about Trey Savage a bunch, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but I'd like his overall arsenal. I think it fits very well with what the Cubs develop. And so he would answer, not that you draft for need, you don't draft for need. We just talked about that, but he would answer a lot of organizational questions. Mm-hmm. You look at who's your third best starting pitching prospect? Well, honestly, then that may even become Jackson Wiggins because Savage jumps at it too. That answers a lot of questions. And so if he happens to be there, that's the sweet spot of a profile the Cubs develop well with an organizational need, with a guy that happens to be talented enough to justify it. And so Savage is the guy that I would look at. If he's not there, I could actually see pitching going in a couple different directions. And so one of them might be the college side. I get a lot of questions on Brody Brecht, but I think I'd be a little bit surprised there. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but I still have some questions with regard to how he develops. But I think that the guy that I would want to cue in on is Jurangelo Sainche, he gets a lot of notoriety for being a switch pitcher. He is mostly a right-handed pitcher now, and a good one. And he does pitch right-handed to left-handed hitters. I think he is my clear SP4 from the college side. And he is a guy that I think would save you a little bit of money. He's getting talked about in the late teens to early 20s. And that's about the same kind of a bonus if you gave somebody $4 million at the Cubs pick.
Mm-hmm.
So, that one kind of fits. And then for the first year, I actually think this is not a demographic that I love jumping into, but I do believe that there are some prep pitchers that the Cubs have been talking to, having some conversations that could be worthy of that selection.
Yeah, that is a risky profile and something that they've
Risky
kind of
demographic.
avoided for years and years and years. How do you kind of balance? I mean, that's we talk a lot about the Cubs like kind of zigging while everybody else zags and things like
Yep.
that. This is a draft that is heavy on college bats up at the top
Yep.
in the first round. And what's the opposite profile of that? It's these high school arms.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just kind of risk mitigate the rest of the draft if you do that. If you go risky early with like a Ryan Sloan, for instance, he's an Illinois prep pitcher, or Cash Mayfield, left-handed pitcher out of Oklahoma, both preps, of course. Cam Caminiti could be another one, but those are the two guys that I would look at, Sloan and Mayfield, where, it's risky. You might not get anything out of them. But then at that point, you can jump in on guys that you feel like these are major leaguers.
Mm-hmm.
You can target, and I think they've done this, target like a guy like Peyton Stovall, who, I don't know if he's a second baseman, first baseman. There's probably somewhere in there, kind of Michael Busch vibes.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of Michael Busch vibes. Dealt with some injuries, but otherwise, I think he'd be a first rounder. Man, you know what? He'd settle in, and you feel like you got a lot of value out of that.
If you're getting him at in the second round
at 54, yeah, exactly. Yep. And so, like, I think that's maybe a strategy they can do. But this is probably the first year that I really think there could be those discussions. Whereas in the past, I'm sure there were, but like I didn't really hear about a ton of it. And I think this is probably be the first year where if a name came out that was a prep pitcher at 14, I'm not going to sit there going like, oh my God, like that was completely off our radar. And those would be the two guys that I would consider most, and maybe Caminiti afterwards. But
because it's a college bat heavy first round, give me a couple names. I know we saw James Tibbs mocked to the Cubs on MLB Pipeline, I believe, or Baseball America.
Pipeline, Baseball America.
We've seen Tibbs a lot. What's the deal with Tibbs? And give me another name as far as bats go.
Yep, two bats I would look at is Tibbs and Malcolm Moore. So Tibbs, decent outfielder, maybe more of a left field profile. The batted ball profile looks really good though. Good exit velocities, good whiffs, good chase. He's just a good player. I mean, he's really good. His teammate Cam Smith is similar in that regard. He's a third baseman. Tibbs is a guy that I think Cleveland floated early as a like, well, if Bazana, if Condon, Caglione don't want to give us a deal, maybe we get like a real sweetheart deal with Tibbs. And I don't think that people bought it. And so now we haven't heard as much buzz. And so Tibbs is kind of like falling down boards. He hasn't really been falling down boards. He's been exactly where he was, which is a guy probably in that 8 to 15 range, but a very good player. The other one I want to note, which is something that we've just seen so many notes about this, is Malcolm Moore, the catcher out of Stanford. And if you want to pick another demographic that's a little bit riskier, it's catcher. I mean, it's definitely high school catcher is the riskiest, but like college catcher, you still have some questions on unless somebody's a generational guy like Adley Rushman. And so, I don't love it, but I do like Moore. And I think he's got a good offensive profile. That same thing, the trifecta. Good exit velocities, good chase, good whiffs. And he does it. And I think there's been some chatter that he really blew, the doors off in interviews. So with teams. And so like, that's a big part. The intangibles is a huge part of catching, like a huge part of catching. So if teams really feel compelled on him, those would probably be the three guys. I know you asked for two, but like Tibbs, Cam Smith, Malcolm Moore are probably a few of the college bats I would look at.
Yeah. Going back down to the second round, I know that you mentioned a name already. Give me a couple names that I know that's probably, if the Cubs go the route where they're going over slot in the second round, you're probably looking at a high school draft pick here in the second round, right?
I would think so. There's a few names that have been linked to the Cubs. There's another high school shortstop I don't want to get into, but he's local here, and he could be. I don't know the answer to that at the moment, but moving outside of that, and I know I kept that vague, sorry, but Kellen Lindsay is a guy that's been linked nationally to the Cubs a few times. A guy that gets kind of Trey Turner comps to it, and hashtag Harold Reynolds comps, but like honestly,
The
this is
style
from
of play.
yeah, and this is from where Trey Turner was at that time in the draft, which is kind of a super fast dude who had some questions, but had the speed for shortstop. No one was sure if he was going to ever develop any power, but like just raw tools. It just kind of looked like the profile of that. Kellen Lindsay gives that vibe. And that is a guy that I could see something like that happening. Another could be they could go prep pitching. If you're not addressing pitching at the top, or even if you do, with like Horton and Ferris, same kind of concept. They could go with a guy like Dasan Hill, who I love. He's one of my favorite lefties in the class. Love his profile. Think he's going to be really, really good. There's some really good prep lefties, but Dasan Hill would be maybe one I would cue in on.
I love it. I love the names. I think it's gonna be fun going back and seeing where these guys fall in the draft. Before we wrap this up, I got to get a deeper cut name
Deeper
or two
cuts.
from you, because
Yep.
I know that people love the Brett Batemans, the Johnny Longs, the Brian Calmers,
Yep.
the guys that were after those first few rounds. A lot of times the college guys in a lot of ways, but people also like the Zaire Hopes and the
Yeah.
Alfonsin Rosarios, right? So like, who are some deeper cut names that have caught your eye?
Yeah, let me hit you up with a couple deep cut names that I just want to mention. A few of them are going to be some preps. So guys like Braden Booth, who honestly I'm kind of split on whether he's a right-hand pitcher or third baseman at the next level, but he's a prep guy, really exciting tools, seems like a good kid. He's one to watch for. Another one is Lucas Buckner, where I'm blanking on what he's committed to as Ole Miss. It's something in the SEC. I'm kind of blanking on that. But a really interesting kind of middle infield type of profile. Again, these are both prep guys. Connor Lehman is another that's a deeper cut, left-handed pitcher. Really interesting down in the deep south kind of area, and that has had some heat on him. I think he's not going to be one of the household names that we're going to be looking at there. And then let me toss you some college guys. Because I don't really know where they profile. I think a few of them might be in my 20-round mock. This isn't from the Cubs, but these are just guys that have caught my eye as somebody to kind of watch for some deep stuff. So guys like Michael Massey, who's a right-handed pitcher out of Wake Forest, he's not so much of a deep cut. He was their closer last year, started this year, had some injuries. Honestly, I think he should probably just close. But he's really good, and I think that fits the profile of a guy that the Cubs can take.
The Cubs love drafting guys that have been injured. They love it. They love
do.
that more than anything on this earth.
It absolutely, a guy like Thatcher Hurd or Tristan Smith, same kind of idea on that. But these are probably not so much deep cuts as like
I was gonna say Thatcher Hurd, maybe third round pick, right?
Third to fifth rounders is where I would look at it. Let me toss you some deep cuts though. Dalton McIntyre, who's an outfielder out of Southern Miss, is interesting, and he kind of maybe gives me some like Brett Bateman kind of vibes, and so maybe I'll toss that name out, and then I'll toss two deeper cuts. One is Garrett Horn. He's a left-handed pitcher out of Liberty. I really liked him entering the season. He's has some injuries. I don't want to guess on what's going on there, but I think they might be some significant ones. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but we didn't see him after a while during the season. Could fit. And then here, I'm going to toss out, this is my like way from the side.
Yeah.
Not my guy, but just like super deep cut, like day 3, like 18th round.
Yes.
Josh Sanders, who's a right-handed pitcher out of Texas Tech. I think he had some heat from the Cubs last year.
Okay.
Didn't get taken. He had a pretty good year this year. I think he's a day 3 guy. And let's say they pop him like the 16th to the 18th round.
The Cubs on Deck podcast, the only place where you're going to get a prediction on the Cubs 18th round draft pick.
Absolutely, sir.
I love it. All right, man. We've got, like we said, a lot coming up. You want to plug some of the work that we got coming up at Northside Bound and elsewhere?
Whew, yeah, I don't know when exactly, but they will come out the week of the draft. A 20-round mock for the Cubs. Full disclosure. About 2 or 3 days before the draft, I go incognito mode, so my stuff gets locked. I don't post it. Even if some guy pulls out of the draft, I'll just have somebody go in and just put some verbiage that's an update. But I lock my stuff a few days ahead of time so I can just talk to folks and get a better sense of the draft without feeling like I'm going to report on anything. And then, I'll have a 20-round mock and then a full mock, for MLB at that point that week. And then shoot, dude, like before that is our re-ranks. So it's coming up like in a week.
next week. Again, we're recording this on July 1st. Wow, we're recording this on July 1st. Yeah. The week of the 8th is our prospect week over at Northside Bound. So myself, the two of us on the call, Greg Huss, Greg Zumach, both coming out with prospect list. Todd Johnson will come out with his updated prospect list. Rich Biesterfeld and Rich Caissie will also come out with their prospect list.
Yep.
In between now and then, I think I'm going to try my very best to post a fan voted on prospect list like we've done the last, I believe, 2 prospect weeks we've done that.
Yeah.
Be on the lookout for that. Go online to northsidebound.com. Vote as much as you'd like on that poll so you guys, the fans, can kind of create your own prospect ranking. That'd be super fun. And then we'll end off prospect week next week with our cumulative list, kind of combining all of our stuff into one Northside Bound prospect ranking. So that'll be fun. Be on the lookout for that. We got a lot of stuff coming up. We've got next week we'll be back. It'll be Brian on the call or on the podcast next week. And then we will be doing a live draft show on July 14th, the day of the draft. We'll be there from the first pick all the way through the Cubs pick at number 14, and then analyzing the Cubs pick for a little bit after the fact. We'll have some guests on the show. It'll be me, Zumach, Todd Johnson, Rich Biesterfeld will be on. We'll also have a couple other guests. We're going to try to get, I think that Brian will be on, somebody else. We're going to have some fun on that live draft show. That'll be a good time. So be sure to tune in to the live show on northsidebound.com. Sorry, on Northside Bound on YouTube page to check that out and watch the live show. So thank you guys. I know that was a jam-packed episode. We had a lot to cover. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Give us a like on the YouTube. Give us a subscription, a comment below. Check us out on social media, all that good stuff. Thank you guys so much, and we will talk to you guys in one short week.
Yeah.